to be able to do one a minute. And I'm always excited to tell these women's stories. I would not have ever been able to do this had I not had a whole team of women behind me. And there were some men too who helped out. But basically, it started back in 2014, and I was president of the Women in Architecture Committee of the American Institute of Architects in Baltimore. And I'd always, every year, the Building Museum down in DC put on a wonderful thing in March for women. And I said, well, why can't we do that in Baltimore? And decided, hey, let's find out who were the women who practiced before all of us and how did they manage. And there were a whole team of people who came on board and said, yeah, let's figure this out. And we had some young upstarts who said, yeah, let's apply for a grant. And they applied for a Maryland Humanities grant. And I thought, oh, they'll learn the hard way, but they got it. And so suddenly we had to create an exhibit, and we were promised that we'd have something by the time that March rolled around, and we found out basically in the fall that we got this. So suddenly it was a mass scramble, and we created a, at the Morgan State University, we had contacts, and we created an independent research study, and we had 2 students who signed up. And so they did the preliminary work to try to hunt down any women's story we could tell. And the other thing we had is the American Institute of Architects at one point took their registry of members and determined who were women among those. It's not always easy to tell if you didn't have the checkbox during its day. And I will say, just so that you know, Maryland still doesn't have a checkbox in its registration form to become an architect in Maryland. So we don't have a way to easily pull that data in Maryland, but we had the AIA spreadsheets that they gave us. And from that, we investigated those women's stories. So a lot of the women were members, and to become a member, in all likelihood, they had a firm. So, but it is amazing to sort of see. Now we can go back to the present. I don't see the presentation anymore, Brenna. I'm ready to get going. I'm sorry. I was giving the lead in because I'm by no means will I take all the credit for this, but I definitely have had the passion to keep it going long after everybody got done with hauling it around the state. I'm like, but and they say, when are you going to write the book? I'm like, this is the book. And unless I have walls to display it on, no one can read it. So I'm just delighted to have new locations to have it. So Brenna, I'm still not seeing the, I'm just seeing your photo. And you're muted, so I can't hear you.
Please, I'm trying to get it to come up. It doesn't seem to want to share. Let me
you
see.
had it up for a little bit.
I know it was working and then it disappeared. So one more.
Okay. Well, I'll be patient. I can gab a little longer. The good news.
Can you see it now?
Yes, I can see it now.
Okay, wonderful. Let me fix the view so that you can see. There we go. Okay, we are.
So the other thing that helped us, so we got a grant from the Maryland Humanities, and then we matched it with a lot of different firms in town, architecture firms and associates and individuals who gave to produce the exhibit. And you can see it's quite elaborate. We had a couple of young architects who helped to design it, and it's just fantastic what they were able to accomplish. So the Baltimore Foundation continues to sponsor it as I travel it about. So I want to give all of them due credit. And now the Women in Architecture Committee has become the Equity Committee. So that's why that's the name on there. So we'll move forward. So the exhibit, we were able to capture about 12 women that were basically, we wanted to do anything before 1970. And because Maryland registration, you couldn't become a licensed architect until they created that whole licensing procedure, and that wasn't until 1935. So they were pretty late in the game. DC, I think, was a whole decade earlier. So we have since found more women than these 12, but that's all we could in the short period of time pull together these stories. The ones in bold are the ones that I will show you work tonight. I can't do them all. We will be here all night. So I'm just I wanted to do some of the early women, so you would see women who might have been practicing back when the 1920s happened. Let's go to the next slide. I think I have a date line. Yes. So this was a chart I created for myself. When we started getting into each woman's story, they were all so different, and it was hard to keep them all straight. And so this was my master chart. And basically what you're seeing is, I think there was 10 women at that time. We hadn't had the other 2 hadn't joined in. And you're seeing basically, I wish I had a little arrow I could point. But if you see at the top, the exhibit period that we really show the work in is basically going from right after World War II. So in the gray at the bottom along the date line, there's World War II, then there's the Depression, and then there's World War I, the Depression and World War II. So those were just major mile markers, just to sort of keep track of how that impacted their profession. And then the other thing you'll see is basically the darkened areas is when they were working professionally. So this would have been when they started working at a firm and before they retired. And then their whole lifeline is extended. And it's what's fascinating to me is we have some women who live to 100, and we have others whose life was cut short and they only lived into their late 60s. So it's in 50s. So it's in both those cases it was cancer that took the women. So so that's one thing. The other thing is you see the different colors. The historic, I call those the historical revivalists, the ones who were creating like Georgian buildings or ones that were more replica of another era versus the modernists. And you can see how there becomes a period right in the middle where they kind of cross over. So architecture styles were in flux. So so that's one thing I just wanted to give you a sense of, and of what of where these women fit into the overall picture. Now, next one.
Jillian, before you move to the next one, we did have a question from Brandy about whether there were any women of color in this group.
Yes, there were, but not in the group that we found. It wasn't until we were done with the exhibit that we learned of 2 women who had the Cassell sisters. Their father was a African-American architect who practiced in DC, and all 3 of his children became architects. And I think they all graduated, was it Cornell? I just know that they all followed in their father's footsteps. And but they would have been at the very tail end. So they would have worked for their father in the like end of the 60s and 70s. I have slides for them, and I could share that at the end if people are interested. But I didn't fold them into this one only because this was about the exhibit. But I'm happy to share them if people are curious. So the other thing that was sort of struck me is we had started this because we were looking for the women in Baltimore. I mean, it was the Baltimore Architecture Foundation, after all, that was sponsoring this. But as it turned out, all the women's work was so far afield. Every dot represents something that was designed by one of these women. And I should point out that not all these women were based in Maryland. So that was the other thing. We created the title, The Early Women of Architecture in Maryland, for a very specific reason. One of the women in the exhibit is not an architect, but she influenced architecture. She did a lot of, she did the whole interior, the mosaics, the ceilings, the floors. She had a big impact, and we included her because she had 3 Baltimore projects, one of the few in our exhibit who had any Baltimore projects. And then there are, I think 3 of the women are DC based. 1 is Delaware based, and 2 maybe New York, or just 1 is New York. So and there's just a handful that then really fall into Maryland, and and a couple of them never were registered in Maryland, but somehow had projects in Maryland. So I don't know if how they did that, but some were married to an architect, so that they could have done it under their husband's license. So that was the other thing I wanted to show you, just how far afield all these projects are. Then I think the last slide I have that's not about the women in particular is this one. There's a lot of stuff here. I don't expect you to all digest it. It's just because if anybody asks me a question, I would have it all there, and I can't remember it all. But the things that are of interest is that the first class that graduates women, MIT is the first one that allowed women in. And that was in 1870, the first class graduates. The first woman who became an architect, a professional architect, and got a license was Louise Blanchard Bethune. I'm not sure I'm saying her last name right, but I've never heard it pronounced. So that's, if anybody knows, they can speak up at the end and tell me. But anyway, she practiced in New York, and she was accepted into the AIA and to the College of Fellows. So College of Fellows is sort of the highest honor in the AIA is our professional organization, the American Institute of Architects. And what was interesting is that when they had the first design competition where women were allowed to compete, which was for the women's building at the World Columbia Exposition in Chicago, Louise refused to compete because the men were going to get paid $10,000 and the women only $1,000 for their design. So kind of a slap in the face. So this group of women were a spunky bunch to be able to believe when everybody else in the profession was saying, only a man could do that. One of the game changers was in 1915, the Cambridge School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture was founded. This was a school just for women to learn architecture, and it was started by a professor at Harvard who was approached by a very wealthy family that said, my daughter wants to become an architect and Harvard won't let my daughter in. What can you do about it? And so he started teaching her, and then before he knew it, other people were joining, and then he formed a whole school. And 3 of the women in this exhibit actually graduated from there. And so I just thought I wanted to point that out because it's sort of very interesting. The other thing that kind of throws things, and our first woman in Maryland is in 1936, which is actually, I think it was 1935, which she actually applied. Maybe she didn't actually get all the registration through until 36, but they didn't start accepting applications until 1935 in Maryland. But anyway, so this is just to say that women started to advance in the field, and then when the war was done, suddenly there were a lot of men who were needing work, and it was seen that women shouldn't be taking their work. So there are women in the exhibit who had to deal with that kind of prejudice. So we can move on to the next one. The images that were on that slide were of the Cambridge School of Architecture, if people were curious. So one of the oldest women, she was, I think, the 3rd one we had in the show, was born in 1895, and she lived a ripe old age of 101. And she has a wonderful story that I want to share because we really need a book about her. She just knew she wanted to be an architect. So she was one of the ones who went to the Cambridge School of Architecture. She first got a degree in Gertrude first got a degree in Bachelor's of Landscape Architecture because they weren't allowed to take the architecture program at that time. So she got a degree in landscape architecture. Then when she found out about the Cambridge School opening, she says, I want to go there. But she was from Illinois, and so she had to sort of make her way there. And then she ended up settling down in DC, and she was just so, the people who she worked for were just so believed in her that they just kept hiring her more and more. So even though some of the women came from more means and that allowed them early on, I don't think that's her story. I think it's partially just her determination. But one of the biggest projects is down in Calvert County, and that's Point Farm. It's where Jefferson Patterson had his estate, where he had all his cattle and such. And I think he was a diplomat who traveled the world. And she ended up, you can turn, that's a picture of her, by the way, and the woman, she's in her boots there on the, that's one of the buildings she's designed. She's out there inspecting. She was the second woman to become an architect in Maryland. You can go to the next slide. So at Point Farm, if you look, what's in white in the middle are all the buildings that she either renovated or designed from scratch. And to your left is a whole complex for the cattle that she designed. The interesting thing is, when she was at Cambridge, her thesis was on town planning. So she never really got to do that except on this farm, where she designed everything and the landscape and such. And there's some of her drawings to the right of the barn detailing. She got to know everything that was needed to make a working farm. So the next one, because she came from farm family, actually. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that's so fascinating is that the family, the Pattersons, after Mr. Patterson died, his wife kept the farm going for a while, and then decided to give it to the state. But with the caveat that nothing can be built there without Gertrude approving it. And Gertrude, at that point, she retired and moved to California. But in 1998, the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab was wanting to, they decided this would be an excellent location for it. And actually, that's it in white in the image to the right. Well, that's it. You're looking at it, the one that's next to the car. And then to the right, the photo in the middle, it's the gleaming white one versus Gertrude's project, which is closer to us with the gray roof. But Adam Gross, I spoke to him because he actually went out to California to meet with her, shipped out the drawings, and there she was, 99 years old, having done a full, red mark edit. And basically, she asked him what these little things were on his facade, and he said, well, those are louvers like you have on your barns. And she said, well, mine work. So basically letting him know it doesn't belong if it doesn't function. So she didn't like it, things that were just pasted on. So but he said that she for the age she was, she couldn't believe she was just still right in there. And there is a picture of her on the right. So Governor Schaefer was so proud of this building, this whole complex, that he declared October 14th, 1994, her day in Maryland. So, and most of the stuff she did, it had a modernist approach, but it still was pretty old school of that time. But the one building she did, which is sort of in a Art Deco style, it was the Junior League headquarters in DuPont Circle, which I show you down in the image below, just so you can see that she actually did start to evolve her architecture. And next slide, please. So, but this talk would be remiss if I didn't include Catherine Cutler Ficken. She was the first woman to become an architect in Maryland. And her story, to me, I much love, because it might not have ever been told if it wasn't just for the fact I refused. to give in. The student who was studying her said, I can't find anything about her. I just don't think we can do anything with her. I'm like, she's the first one. No friggin' way. So I did everything. I went to LinkedIn, I went to Facebook. I went back through all the obituaries, nothing in hers, nothing in her husband's. And she was the one who died early because she died of cancer. But it was her husband's second wife. Her obituary. She's a big woman in the church. Lots of people came, and a Rudolph Ficken Jr. and his wife Jill from Newbern, North Carolina. And I said, well, who's this junior guy? I'm kind of curious. So I ended up getting the white pages for Newbern, North Carolina, and I called. Well, there was no Ficken in there. So I looked for the only Jill that was in there, and I blind called, and sure enough, Jill answered, and she said, yes. I said, any chance you know of a woman architect who lived in Silver Spring, Maryland? And yes, that was my husband's mother. And so I had found basically her son. And so that's the only reason why I even know half of what I have to share with you tonight. A couple of the images I do want you to see is that her father was a prominent architect in Washington, D.C., Howard Cutler. And you can see the article titled, Dad Displeased Once, Proud of Girl Now. What he was displeased about is she used to like steal his tools or play with them or whatever, his little drafting tools. So but then when she got older, she actually went to work for him, and he was prominently known, especially in the 30s when it was very hard getting other kinds of work, of doing a lot of the schools for Montgomery County. And this is one, Chevy Chase Elementary is one that she worked on, which is what the image in the middle is. And then her license, yeah, it says 1936 on to the right side. All right, next. So one of the things, the other thing that's just absolutely delightful that I would never have known is she had a letter in her portfolio that her son gave me. And this is the letter, and I'll read it to you in a moment, but I want to point out to you that to the left is a building that I tracked down in, let's see, this is Solomon's Island. It's the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory. I think it's in Solomon's Island. And it actually, if you look, has her name on it. It's the lower left-hand side. So she's credited as being the architect, and this is 1938. So that same year, she's now a member of, since 1936, she's been a member, a registered member. So she's been the Maryland Society of Registered Architects. This is the president writing back to her. She must have asked if she could go to their event. And this is what he says. I have your letter in regard to the dinner and annual meeting of the Maryland Society of Registered Architects. It goes without saying that you are certainly eligible to attend the dinner in so much as you are a member of the society. You have the distinction of being the only lady architect in the society, and it must be left to your discretion whether you would wish to be the only lady in an entire gathering of men. You sort of put me on the spot in asking me to advise you in such a matter. I will, however, do what architects frequently do, straddle the fence, and say that whatever you decide to do on the advice and judgment of your good father would be agreeable to us. With very best wishes. So, you know, I don't know about you, but that's like, she kept that letter. She glued it into her portfolio. So I just had to laugh because when I realized the same year she has a building with her name on it, but she has to get permission from her dad to be with other architects. She wasn't married though, so it might have been touchy during that period. Over to the right-hand side is some more modern buildings. I think she did these with her father, but those are her drawings. And that drawing above, the one in blue, I didn't know what the building was. That's her, she didn't label things in her portfolio. So I had to track it down, and I did. I tracked it down to it being in Hyattsville. So this is a whole labor of love just to get to every woman's story. Next slide. I want to show you another prize project that I tracked down. So she designed, Claire Hyatt was a wealthy woman, but she's a widow, and she had a farm, and it was during the war years, and she wanted to be able to manage it all herself. So she wanted an architect to design it, and she wanted that woman being a woman architect. And so she hired Catherine. And so I knew of Catherine because the Montgomery County Commission had come across her work and had started to point out that she was the first woman architect. So, and there was these images, the ones that are black and white, come from Catherine's portfolio. So I didn't have those, but I did have the image in brick below that was on a website that the owners of that place now were very proud of it. And there's fairy tale book building and about Catherine who had designed it. And it wasn't until I began looking at the images that I realized they're the one and the same, and you can see it with the silo. That silo is what holds the stairs, and that's what's on the left-hand side is a photo I took when I was inside the building. But it has some wonderful detailing. You can see there's a picture of a truss, of the ceiling. And the other aspect I want to show you is above is what it looked like at the time. Nothing around. There's the house structure, and then over to the right-hand side, you see the barn. So just fields, right? Where it is today, and I did it in the aerial I got from Google, it's just in the middle of a suburban, it's just like, you know, suburbs, just almost swallowed it up, except this one little piece of land. And you can see the building that has the turret right smack in the middle. Next slide. I think this is the last slide on Catherine is the next one. I did want to show her father. This was a sketch she did of her father. Her father, I believe, died of cancer. I think one of her sisters, if not both, died of cancer, and she too. So it definitely was in the family. And I think it was when her father got cancer that Catherine suddenly woke up to the fact that she had devoted herself to architecture, but she wasn't married. She had nobody. And when her father would die, she still had her sisters, of course, but she gets married in 1947. The father was already, there was something in the paper of having a long illness. He dies in 1948, but she gets married in 47. And then her work just drops off. She starts to work on having a son. I mean, by this time, she's not a spring chicken. And she eventually, she did end up having at least one miscarriage. And the way we know about that is her son kind of heard stories, and her son was adopted when he was 4 months old, when she was 45 years old. And she then ended up passing away. I mean, like not much later than that. I mean, he was only like 12. And so then it was really when his dad remarried, it was really that second family that he kind of knew more, but he had this portfolio. And there's a picture of the portfolio on the upper right-hand side. And I believe she created that portfolio for her son, so he would know of her. I think it was done not at the time of the projects were happening, but when she knew she had this, when she was diagnosed having cancer, and she had lived through it with her father, so I think she knew it was coming. And so you can see to the right, the uppermost right side, you see the photos that are there, pasted in. And so that some of them I could put together as a set, but others I had to figure out what projects they were. And then below, under that, is a photo. The man on the left was the owner at the time of the house that was done by a farmstead. And then to the right is her stepson. He's come up twice to Maryland now. One time to give me the portfolio with all the works of it, works of architecture in it. He said he had lots of her drawings, but they burned in a fire, and so he only had one set left. And so I don't think I put that image in this exhibit, but in this presentation, but it is in the exhibit. And then the second time he came up, I asked him to bring the photos, family photos. And because he said, oh, you won't get anything out of that. And I said, no, there'll be something. And sure enough, we were able to find a few more buildings that, she'd be standing in front of with her family or whatever. And we did have one where she clearly had a baby bump. And so, there was parts of her life story that you could learn from that. But we don't have any of her writings. We have one article that was written about her. She did get I'm not sure if we go check the next slide. I don't think I have another one of her. Yeah, we're on to the next person. Yeah. But anyway, she did won an award for a restaurant she did in DC, and it was kind of an art modern building, very, very modern of its time. And so she got this award, and it was, it was all the new kind of equipment you had. And so it was great seeing the before and after slides of this more Victorian place and then how she modernized it all. And she did a number of works around for University of Maryland and such. So anyway, you'll see more photos of stuff that she did in the exhibit. So I just threw Ida Brown in here because Ida was also born in 1899. And so, she might have started to do and dabble around the 1920s when we had the women's rights to vote start. This particular, I don't know much about Ida. We discovered this one building she designed that's in Owings Mills. It's just drop dead gorgeous building, especially inside, just how spaces all move into each other and her use of materials. But I include it for the next slide. And she was a New York architect. She did a lot of stuff on public housing in New York. But if you go to the next slide, it was the words I thought was fascinating to me. See, she opened her office in New York in 1933, which a lot of these women were making it in the Depression, which is just really, really amazing. But she obtains her Maryland registration in 1957. That building that I showed you that was in Owings Mills is from the 40s. So there must be other work of hers, but I have not been able to discover that yet. But there was an article that was written in the Salisbury Daily Times in 1958, Women Architect Blames Fads for Home Designs, where she couldn't stand, she says, people go in for fads in building just as they do in clothing. And she hated when people say, I want one of this and one of that, and I want a split level ranch, I want this and that. She wanted to make buildings, if people would plan their homes according to their own individual needs and tastes, the face of America wouldn't need lifting so often, is what she was quoted as saying. So I just thought that was pretty cool. That's all I have on Ida for this talk. Then we have Victorine Dupont Homsey. And Victorine, I wanted to show just because she has some cool buildings that are up in the northeast end of the state, because she was a Delaware architect primarily. There was a period of time that she moved to the DC area, and so she has some work in Greenbelt. But these are drawings of hers, and she had articles that she would put in. Here's a thing on families with children, how to create and plan for that. It was all part of trying to open up the house and not making it so box-like, so that you can watch your children while you work. So next, she was one of the ones that was the crossover. So she DuPont, that's what kept her going. She and her husband. If you head to the next slide, I think it tells a little of her background. Oh, no, I skipped that. I think it's the next one over, but keep to this one, because what I wanted to point out with this one is some people might know the Candy Carousel because it was up in Elkton on along Route 40, I believe. And so this is kind of a cool little building. What it looks like now is down below in yellow. And in her home office in Delaware in 1940, she is with her husband. He was an architect as well. And so they were practicing architects and raising two sons. And one of the sons became an architect and then worked in her firm. But they were put on the map by this building below, the Henry Robinson residence. The modern style of it caught the eye of the architects in the profession. And so that was exhibited in a big, there was an exhibit up in New York that was pretty infamous. And so they were one of the most published of all the women. And she was the most published, she and her husband, of all the people in this exhibit because of her, and this is in our exhibit, because of just how they were able to rise above in their architecture and draw that attention, yet they kept alive. The bread and butter was making things like you have up in Wilmington. And you can go to the next slide. Yeah, no, I didn't have any more of her. I'm so sorry. Yeah, I would have liked to have shown one or two more pieces of her because it's very fascinating how she kind of bridged both worlds. But I mean, the other great thing about Victorine is there are like over 20 buildings on the Eastern Shore that are hers and her husband's. And so, you know, I just had a great time exploring all over places I don't usually go, just to hunt them down, knocking on people's doors and saying, hey, can I come in? and people, I don't know, I just was very lucky. People were generous and excited to learn themselves about who designed. One of them was the Washburn residence. They were happy to open their door. They actually had all the clippings still. This is Clothiel Woodward Smith, who was quite a lady. She had one of the largest architecture firms in DC during her day. And this project is out in St. Michael's. And the cool thing about it is it has an indoor, so it has an indoor court you can see, but the building itself surrounds and it's all very glassy. And then it all looks out on this beautiful land. And you know, you look out on the water. And so it was the way it captured the land. Yeah, it's very much like Frank Lloyd Wright. It was very much coming from that. And even the little courtyard, that little court rolling to the right-hand side, she puts a brick fence wall around it, so it's enclosed. So I mean, it's all the means of enclosure that just is so striking about this building. But most of the things she did that she's known for are not the single family. If you go to the next one, you'll see some of the bigger projects. So if you ever drive to the south of Washington, D.C., you will come across these as you cut through the highways. There's huge projects, Capitol Park projects, just gigantic. You can see that's her in the middle with the model of the whole complex. And very modern at its time. It also had townhouses involved. Of course, they ripped down all the neighborhoods in that area. A lot of, I'm sure in this day and age, they displaced a lot of people. But she was very ambitious, and she would never have wanted to be in our exhibit if she was living today. She said, I am an architect with a capital A. Being a woman has nothing to do with it. And this I discovered she'd written in the University of Oregon, which is my alma mater. She wrote it in Alumni magazine. And she, in fact, in this little article in Life, Women Arise, she makes something, says, I think there's a lot of outcry over inequity of the sexes is made up. I'm terribly bored by this women live business. It seems so terribly self-conscious to just keep saying they didn't do it right by us. So she didn't let anything get in her way. And the sad thing is that unlike a lot of the women in the exhibit, her two children died before I ever met them. A couple years before we started getting going on the research. But both, it turned out, one was living in like Kenya and the other was living in Spain. So they nowhere near the mom. So it's like, I'm not sure what happened there. Her husband was very high, I think high up in the CIA. It must have been really hard living in that household, but I guess I gotta do a time check. Oh shoot, 8. Oh darn, sorry, I just talk on too much. All right, so just the point with her is I ended up going to the University of Oregon, and one of my jobs at the was the graduate teaching fellowship was to take the drawings that that students made and to take them for the archives. And they were like, kids didn't, students didn't want to give them up. I don't blame them, but that's what they did at University of Oregon. So then when I realized she went there, I checked, and sure enough, they had 13 of Clothil's drawings. So when I went to Oregon a couple of years later, I actually stopped and took photos of the work she did when she was a student. One of the pieces in the exhibit is one of those photographs. So next one. We only have 2 more women left, and I will try to be quick with Helen. She was the first woman who was an architect in the AIA Baltimore chapter. However, she didn't have a firm at the time, and when she did get a firm, she got out of Dale. She's still living, and so she was able to tell me that she had no interest in being an architect in Baltimore because it was so blue blood, so old school. So she just felt like, here's a picture of her, the Belvedere Hotel. She's the only woman other than the secretary of the AIA. And so, she didn't feel it. She ended up going down to Pasadena and starting anew. But I wanted to bring her in because she does have a project in Bel Air, the Bel Air townhouses, which is on Franklin Street. A lot of her stuff was very modest, I would have to say, but she was balancing 5 kids that she raised. So next slide. But there's this beautiful project she did in Herondale, and it's this church. It's just gorgeous inside. This is, the trusses and everything. So her husband was a mechanical engineer. And there's a picture of her in the Baltimore Sun at a drafting board. So she got a little notoriety at the time. Next slide. And so the last one I'll talk about, and I have to be quick, is Poldy Hirsch. Poldy Hirsch is actually a Hartford resident. She was born in Germany, and it was really because of Hitler and having to leave there that she ended up meeting her husband down in Palestine at the time. And he wanted to be a doctor, and she was very interested in becoming an architect. And so when he went up to Switzerland to finish his degree, she also was part of a program there. She went to 2 different architecture schools. The first architecture school she went to, she had a hard time graduating from it because apparently they were just pounding into them the modernists. It was Corbu. It was like this. She was just if you didn't do what they wanted, you just didn't graduate. So she ended up going to the technical school, and there's an image of her above. And then when she and her husband married, and he got work in Pittsburgh. They moved to Pittsburgh in the States. They thought it would be a land of opportunity. And in that process, she ended up having a daughter, and then another daughter, and then a 3rd daughter. And the beautiful thing about it is when they decided, when he finished his residency in Pittsburgh, they didn't want to stay in Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania required them, because they're not residents, that they had to take an English test. And they were so affronted by that they found out Maryland didn't make that requirement. And so they came down to Maryland to look for a place for him to start his practice. And they just happened to come to Harvard Grace because at that time their daughter really wanted a soda to drink, and they went to the local soda shop on their way down 95, and I don't know, 95 existed then, but it was a major road. It was the major transit road that goes through there. And her husband, yeah, it's incorrect. They spoke 4 languages fluently. Yes, well, that was the point. They spoke them fluently, and that's why they didn't care to be put through that in Pennsylvania. So they came to Harvard Grace, though, when they found out that, hey, they could use a medical doctor here, and it seemed like a very friendly family place. The trouble is, it's not necessarily a place well, there's not many architects. I mean, a lot of things are built by the master carpenters. If you go to the next slide. And Poldy was she was very much an artist. These are works of hers from the 40s. Next slide, please. And this is sort of the training that she had in school, was both dealing with the Beaux-Arts on the left and then sort of the modern approach on the right. In this case was the theater that she designed. Next slide, please. So when she came to Harvard Grace, what she found is that there was no architects there, or not any that would hire a woman architect. And a lot of what was there was very Victorian. There wasn't a modern field to Harvard Grace, as you know. So she ended up, with her family's help, becoming in some ways an architect developer. They would buy a piece of land and she would build on it. In this case, the Rothenberg residence was for, I think, her, now I know I have one of the Hirsch's on this line, so she'll have to Dahlia, incorrect. Yeah, Dahlia, is this her father's? Yes, for her father, right. So her father lived in there, and which was right near to where she lived. Here's a picture of her sort of in her office, home office. There's all her kids. She ended up, and then playmates in the neighborhood. Next slide. So they started out very modest. But her sort of like real put it on the map building was when she designed her husband's office, which, don't be fooled by this photo on the left. That little gable you see there is not part of the Medical Arts building. It's the Victorian building behind it you're seeing there. No, hers is jutting out with the portico, and it was only a 1-story building, but she designed it so that it could become a 2-story building, and indeed it did to the right-hand side, because all 3 of her daughters went into the medical arts. And you have some interior, she sort of hand done the banisters and picked out the lighting fixtures. So this was really quite a tour de force, and that's how I found out about her. Somebody who really loved mid-century modern had put a little website blog, and some of these photos are from that. And I ended up going to Harvard Grace and hunting the building down, and I couldn't for the life of me get anybody to answer. I tried for a while, tried to find someone who would. It's hard when you don't know anybody, when you don't know their phone numbers, it's to get information, it's not easy. So, but what I ended up doing was reading articles and found out that one of her daughters was married to an architect, and I knew how to get a hold of an architect. So that's how I got to know her 3 sisters, is because her youngest is married to an architect in the profession, and they were just a delight because they held still a lot of the treasure, a lot of the drawings. Go to the next slide, please. And I wanted to show you a few things. There to the right hand, there she is with her father. So he did a lot of the building, and the construction ledger that the family kept has every single thing that they spent money on, written out. So, and I found one page where it had Poldy Hirsch, $300. I hope that's not all she got for her designs, but who knows? But one of her bread and butter was creating, over to the left-hand side, what we'd only call as a prototype today. because there's 17 of these in Havre de Grace, individual units, but they're a duplex, so they're side by side. They're basically like two townhouses, but they make one block. But she designed it, she really felt that if people had to have starter homes, if they were going to really make it in the world, and they needed to have a porch, and inside you look, they have wood ceilings. She liked to work with natural materials, and they were built, you know, solidly. So one apparently had a tree that dropped on it and it didn't cave. So it was very unusual during this time of the 60s to have things so well built like they were. So it really was her determination to do it right. Next slide, please. And here's another larger project, the Park Apartments in Aberdeen. And again, everybody has a porch and lots of light in the units. Next slide, please. But where she really excelled, and it's so beautiful, is the residential homes that she did. Here, this is the summer residence that is sketch that she did inside. There's a sort of 3D view I have of when we did a tour for a Docomomo tour. Next slide, please. And her home is probably, you know, the most beautiful gem of all. My understanding is the family that has now bought it does have it like an Airbnb. You can actually rent and stay there in a portion of it. These were the earlier photographs that were taken at the time for the newspaper. Next slide, please. And this is what it is today. And it just was this ceiling that goes all the way through, and the way the light passes through. It was just beautifully done. And she worked very hard on it. I don't know if we passed it already. If you could go, can you go back one second? I think. Yeah, oh yeah, you could go forward, sorry. Oh, well, yeah, go forward. We need to keep going forward. We have to finish. I just wanted to point out that fireplace that she had was very unusual at that time. People didn't build standing fireplaces. The fire marshal was not convinced at all, and at first wouldn't allow them to build it like that. And so it was one of the last things that went in. But she imported these Italian marble, they're not marble, sorry, but tiles behind them that were fireproof. And in the end, it was approved. But you can see just how, you know, beautiful and open, and to the right is the kitchen. So you never, and how below you can see how she's trying to work out the whole circulation to make it make sense. So, I mean, she was very thoughtful about things. And I think that's true with all these women. I mean, they made places fit like a glove in their design work. And next slide, please. She did have some things that were a little edgy. This mansard, full mansard building still exists, and I guess that's how the family wanted it, but it is quite unusual in its day. And then the proposed Jewish center, they didn't go for that design because it was probably more modern that they could accept, but still she was trying to do unique things. She wanted the forms to speak and to have some dynamic quality to it. So it probably would have been beautiful, you know, especially inside and looking outside, that had it been built. But she died when she was 61. Again, it was cancer, and it's so sad because there's so much more, you know, when I'm just surprised that each woman's story is just so different. And even though she died young, she did an incredible amount of work that we know of. And again, because she stayed where she was, she made it work in a little town like Havre de Grace, sorry. And let me see, what's the next slide? I think I wanted to show her legacy continues. We did a Docomomo tour of 5 of her buildings, and this was back in 2015. And then and then we've had people who've written about her and her whole aesthetic and how she was trying to make healthy places for people to live that were inexpensive but had beauty to them. And next slide, please. And this is her 3 daughters together in front of the Medical Arts Building. And then, of course, she didn't exist, but her husband at that time, this is before he passed, he's in the center. And surrounded on either side of him is Helen Staley. She's to the left. And Shirley Kennard, she was still living. She's the last woman on our exhibit. And there's her next to her exhibit piece to the right of that. And below is Helen with all her extended family that came. So it opened, our exhibit, it opened at the Maryland Institute of Architects in Annapolis. And Helen and Shirley and Polly's husband, they never all met before this time. So it was just wonderful bringing them all together. It was just an absolute delight. And I think we're on to questions. Next, I think that should be it. Yeah, questions. And you can go right to the next slide. I just wanted to show, I'll leave this up. This has got all, if you're interested in knowing more, I'm sure Brenna could put in the chat box some of these links. So if you want to click on them and learn things more about, we do have a website where we have some of the women's stories captured. So I would love to take questions. I know I spoke pretty fast about some things and I probably spoke wrong about other things. So I would love to hear, and you can actually, I don't know, do we have any questions?
We do. Dee had a few questions that she asked right towards the beginning. I'll make sure that we get to those. So Dee, did you want to ask your questions directly or would you like me to ask them for you? I'll go ahead and ask them.
You can ask them. You can ask
them. Okay, great. All right. So first of all, we had a couple of people who were interested in seeing the slides of the women of color who were part of this. You weren't able to put in this exhibit, but they would love to see those slides. Dee's first question was asking about, she says, with the advent of rehabilitation and historic preservation in cities like Baltimore City, is there evidence between commercial buildings and residential buildings? Dee, I don't know whether you want to elaborate on that.
Okay, I noticed that when you, Baltimore is a blue blood type of city still, and you notice that it's a sort of a masculine architecture.
Yeah.
But when you get to about the architecture of the 1930s, it looks a little different. Like you may have had some domestic input, like somebody really thought about the sensibilities and the utility of the inside. And I was just wondering if that was influenced by women architects in Baltimore City.
Well, I think that I think women did start to have an impact on the field, and it's not, there are men who did design and really understand places, but it really came with the women understanding how to make it work with families. But you know, I can't say, because the profession itself started to change. I mean, in the beginning, it really, they were trying, every time was trying to be emblematic of another time, of another place, of another, you know, speak to a hierarchy. And you know, that started to break down. I think all it takes is a couple of wars and a depression, and, you know, kind of, so there are parts of the field that was very much like, we're going to replace all that, but we're going to go modern, we're going to go big, we're going to go brutal, we're going to, you know, but there was a whole nother element that came out, and it was much more try to make things fit right for the community, try to make it, you know, there was an attempt to create better town planning. But it's hard for me to have the perspective on it, because I don't want to say, I just have known some really wonderful men architects, so I just don't want to totally make it a male female thing. But these particular women did seem to have a sensitivity to trying to create wonderful environments down to the last detail. I do have those slides if you want me to quickly show those.
Yeah, and while you're looking them up, Dee had a couple of other questions. One was about whether there are clusters of architecture influenced by women in Baltimore City.
Yeah, you know, we are still doing the research on this. So what we've been painstakingly trying to identify the women by going to the Maryland um, State Register Board of Architects and going through all their records and trying to identify who were women and who were men, because like I said, they didn't have a checkbox. So you go by if they have an initial or if they have a woman sounding name, but then again, those changed over time. And so, and we are also trying to reach out to the women that are still living and finding out who they knew. So we don't, you know, a lot, when I lived in Maryland when I was in high school and college. Then I went away to graduate school when I decided to go into architecture way across the other side of the states. And I ended up coming back, and for various reasons. I would have also loved to have stayed out there, but in the end, I'm glad I came back because my mom's here, my family's here, and they mean a lot to me too. And I can tell you that it was very odd because there did feel still a little of that blue blood going on in this town. And but I went to work I worked for a firm called Cho Wilkes and Bennett at the time. It was a woman-owned firm, 2 women owned it, and I knew a lot of women in the field. I think at that time Barbara Wilkes became the first AIA president, who was a woman, and then we soon followed a woman who was head of the Maryland AIA, and so I just didn't see that women didn't have a place. But what I discovered from this exhibit, it was just one generation. I mean, like I was living off the coattails of that generation 10 years before me. But before that, it was very much vacuous. So we're still trying to capture that.
One more question from Dee, and then we can take a look at those slides. And just as a reminder, everyone, at the end of this, I will show the video that we showed at the beginning that walks you through the exhibit in case you missed it or missed part of it. As well as I have put in the chat a couple of places, information about when you can see the exhibit and where you can find out more. So Dee had one further question, and we can also open it up if anybody else has questions. Dee was asking, given that there are many cottage industries in Baltimore headed by women like glass making and tile making, whether these women architects hired women in the allied trades as part of their work.
Yeah, that's another good thing we could look at. I do know when, so downtown is at 10 Light Street, which is this huge Art Deco building. And I found an article in the Sun, and it did speak about the women and men who helped design this building. One of the women in our exhibit, she did the floor, but I'm sure there were others. And the fact that the article referred to both women and men, it makes me just very intrigued to find out who all of them were. But I don't know fully their story. The interesting thing, and I don't know, I guess what I'll do is I'm trying to get it to share. I think you have to give me sharing privileges, right? Or do I have sharing privileges?
I can, let me stop sharing and make you a co-host so that you can share as well.
Okay. Because the reason why I wanted to stop and show the story of Martha and her sister.
Go ahead and share.
Okay, let's see, share. I'm gonna see if this does it. It's, I don't know. I do this and slideshow. It keeps wanting to jump over to the other screen. So I don't know what you're seeing.
We can see your screen.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So Martha Cassell Thompson. So her father is pictured there, Albert. Oh no, that's her brother. Hang on, let me see. Yeah. So she's the younger. Oh, okay. I think I'm out of here. Sorry. This is exactly why I wasn't going to be the one to do the slides. Let's try this again. So the sisters are only like a year apart, but they both went to work for their father, Albert Cassell. And And they both went to Cornell. That's where their alma mater, and was their father's as well. And so they were working as a drafts women and their father's firm in the 1947 to 1951. Then they got married, and then their stories, I've only been able to find a little bit on them. For instance, Martha, she helped design that rose window that's in the cathedral. So I know that much about her. And her sister, Alberta, she went to work for the Navy Seas, and she helped with the whole Naval Research Laboratory that's depicted in this image. She went on to write a book called Little White Butterflies. They're just little things. I just know little snapshots of things on these women. And that's the frustration. And I'm sorry that the screen's all, I think it's because I didn't make these PDFs of these, so that it just makes the text all go wonky. But anyway, those were the two African-American women. But again, part of our problem is when you're looking, you don't even have a checkbox for women. You certainly don't have a checkbox for minorities. So it's really hard to get their stories. And what's happened is Professor Dale Green over at Morgan State University has done a lot of research on the early African-American architects in Maryland. And what he's found, he has an incredible number, because what happens if you're an African-American, you end up working for a firm that's filled with African-Americans, because it was always this two, white-black kind of for a while in the profession even. And so once he finds a firm and he can get their records, he finds a lot of other people, and usually they would work at, they would do things also for the African-American community. And so the churches and other things. And so he's picked up an immense amount of research in the time he's been doing it, many more than the women that we have. But again, he's only found these two women in all his research. So, but that's why they weren't in the exhibit. But I did try to put something together about them so that we would have for when, I especially when I do talks that are, like I did a talk in St. Mary's County, and so many of the people there, they need to see a broader picture. And I remember when this was in southern St. Mary's, and I was just sort of struck with how white our exhibit was. It's sort of like, ugh. But that's, in the short 4 months, 5 months we had to pull it together, that's as much as we could find. But I'm so glad to have had an ability at least to have a story of two women who were of color who made it in the field. Any other questions? I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I don't know what everybody's seeing now.
We don't have, I just want to leave it open in case anybody has any questions and you didn't get to ask them. If you don't have any questions, of course, you can always share your questions with us through the Liriodendron website. You can email their email contacts on the Eventbrite page, but also if you just email info@liriodendron.com, and I'll put that in the chat.
So I did want to point out, we do have one of the daughters on the call for Poldy Hirsch, and she's been adding little things to the text box. Yes, her mother designed the fireplace. Her mother designed everything. I mean, I would hear stories like she would even design how the conduit went down behind the wall, just so that it was all well organized. Drove the contractors crazy. But I don't know, Dahlia, did you want to speak up and say anything? Because I'm sure you would have done much more justice to your mom than I have. She might want to remain anonymous. I did want to point out, you can speak up anytime if you want. I did want to point out that the exhibit was to go in September. It was supposed to be at the Cecil County Library. And they're not certain they're going to be up and open. And if that case, it will stay where it is now.
That's right. We haven't confirmed it yet, but Jillian and I were just talking prior to this presentation. If Cecil County Public Library isn't able to be open to have the exhibit showing, then we will keep it at the Liriodendron in our gallery space for another month. So I will be certain to email you. Everybody who is here, we have your email from your Eventbrite registration or whatever email you used for that. We will send out an email blast to let folks know if it's going to stay. And I did also want to point out that there is, in addition to the next 2 Wednesdays from 1 to 7, we have a concert that's happening on the 23rd of August. It's part of our Music at the Mansion concert series. And we have 2 outdoor concerts this summer. So that's our first one. And while that is happening during the 2 hours that is going on, people are also welcome to tour the exhibit, although we probably will have the gates up for our rooms because we won't have staff upstairs monitoring, but you'll at least be able to take a glance. Also, if you're interested in coming to see the exhibit and you can't make it on either of those Wednesdays, you can always call and make an appointment to come in. If we have staff who will be there, then we're happy to let you in the house and let you see it while we're there. So you're always welcome to email us at info@liriodendron.com or call us, and I will also put that phone number in the chat there if you want to make an appointment to come and see it.
And I did want to put a plug in, it occurred to me, if you guys are history buffs and really like learning this kind of stuff, the Baltimore Architecture Foundation, since COVID struck, has been putting on a series of virtual history series. So it's always at 1 o'clock on Friday, and it's only for a half hour, so it's supposed to be over a lunch period. And it's not just Baltimore. It's sometimes talks about outside of Baltimore. I know the next one coming up is about a building in Baltimore that the suffragettes helped construct. So that should be very interesting. And I will be giving another talk. I'm going to try to focus on the women really of the 1920s. That will be also this month. I think it's like the last Friday. I don't have all the dates in my mind, but I put in the chat box the Facebook link for if you're on Facebook, and if you're not on Facebook, you can visit the Baltimore Architecture Foundation website, which I'm putting in the chat box again. They're doing this with the Baltimore Heritage, so it's also up on the Baltimore Heritage website. And I know for those, they've been uploading those to YouTube, so you can even see them afterwards. But as far as this talk tonight, it is being recorded, and I'm sure it will be shared in some manner or another. Either on your website or some.
Right. We'll make sure that if we don't have permission to use anybody's voice, that we will edit that part out. But for your presentation, we are recording this, so we will have it accessible on our website. I'm not exactly sure when, but we'll be sending an email out to let people know. So if you got through here through an Eventbrite ticket, then we'll have your email address, and we'll make sure to let you know when that's up. It does look like Dee had one other question about alley houses. Dee,
alley houses, yeah.
Ask about that?
Well, what I find so fascinating about Baltimore is that in the beginning, before we had cars that took everybody away from each other, people lived in the same communities. They were side by side. You had the larger homes, the wealthier homes, but you also had the people who had to work the homes or work in the industries, and those were usually the people in the alley houses. And so Baltimore is very, very dense. I mean, housing, because they packed so many people in. Everybody had a little slot of land. But it gave them all a presence on the street. But I don't know that those were designed per se by women over men, but it certainly was a style that caught on. Charlie Duff has just written book about the row houses and where they came from, and he just gave a talk last Friday on this very same thing. So if you look it up, you'll probably find it. It's not on the alley houses though, but it's on how the row houses evolved. There is a book on the Baltimore alley houses. I know that was done. And I don't know if they have that posted on the Baltimore Architecture Foundation website. I do know they have several resources. The foundation has put out several books on architecture in the city. So anyway, check them out.
Great.
And
well, thank you so much, Jillian. We are running over time, so I want to make sure that we have a chance to show the video one more time for those who may have missed it.
that's right.
We do thank you so much, Jillian. It's been a real pleasure to have you speak about these amazing women and to learn more about them. Please do come by the Liriodendron the next 2 Wednesdays. We're open from 1 to 7. And like I said, if you can't make it during those times, you certainly can call to make an appointment to just stop in and see them when it's more convenient for you. I will just end by saying thank you again to the Drescher Foundation and to Harford County for helping to provide support for this presentation and for the exhibit. And we will end with showing the video. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And just one moment, I will share my screen and get that movie again.
You've been a great host. Thank you for taking care of all this.
It's been my pleasure. My pleasure.
So what you'll see, were to come to the exhibit on the early women of architecture in Maryland, is 3 rooms that showcase the work of 12 women. We start out in the large room where we give a little background on Maryland and key points that happened during women's development in the field. And then we have the first woman in the exhibit, which is Rose Greeley. And she was actually more of a landscape architect, but she is the first woman to be registered in Washington, D.C., and has a number of projects in Maryland. And Hildreth Meyer never became an architect, but she influenced over 64 buildings throughout the US, including some you may recognize, the Great Dome in the National Academy of Sciences. And then Gertrude Sawyer, who was the second woman in Maryland to become registered as an architect. Ida Brown Webster, who was actually a New York architect, but she did a wonderful building in Owings Mills that would rival any structure done by the men of her day. And we move over into the second room. So this mansion is gorgeous in and of itself, designed by Wayne Milting. And we have the next woman. We're doing these in order of their birth year. Victorian DuPont Holmesy, who had a firm with her husband, who was also an architect, that started right during the Depression. And yet they were able to do quite a number of projects in Maryland. I think has up to 24, though they were Delaware architects primarily. They had a firm in Wilmington, Delaware. And Clothiel Woodward Smith, who had one of the largest architecture firms in Washington, D.C., and had lots of work in Maryland. And so we have her, followed by Catherine Thicken. She, her father was an architect. And so even though she was born after Clothiel, and she tends to be old school, but Catherine was actually the first woman to be registered in Maryland the same year registration was offered, which is 1935. One of the things that Hartford County can be proud of is Polly Hirsch. She is actually the first woman in the AIA, or the American Institute of Architects, that's what it stands for, Baltimore chapter, who had her own firm. And she has over 24 buildings in Harvard de Grace that still exist that were her creation. And on display is also some of the designs of those spaces. So you can see her earlier sketches. Here's the Hartford Jewish Center, which actually never was built quite in her vision. It was more modern than people could accept at the time. And then we have one remaining room. And that's the four last women in the exhibit. We have Amelita Roddick. And we know of her work because she actually gave a lot of her pieces to a collection down in Virginia that is an international Women of Architecture archives. And then Helen Ross Staley, who actually is still living, and she's living in North Carolina. And there's a wonderful project she did that still exists today, Herondale Presbyterian Church. And Mary Crago, she actually didn't have her own firm, but she worked for NIH and basically reviewed and buildings all over the US. And Shirley Kennard, who passed away actually since this exhibit was put together. But she and her husband, who was also an architect, had a lot of projects, a lot of residential particularly, all around the Washington, D.C. area and the Maryland metropolitan area around D.C. primarily. And so those are the 12 women that are in the exhibit. And it's a very lovely place to come visit because it's also, you have the architecture of the Liriodendron, which is dendron, as I understand. Everybody likes to pronounce it wrong, but it's still a very gorgeous place to come see this exhibit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jillian, and thank you everybody for being here. We really appreciate your spending some time with us, and we hope that we'll see you in person at the Liriodendron sometime soon. And please don't hesitate to be in touch if you have questions. Thank you.